Imagine standing on a quiet hillside 2,000 years ago, looking out across a world that felt impossibly vast and full of marvels. Before we go any further, if you want a brand new Earth topic every single night to fall asleep to, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. The sky above you is the same sky we see now. The same slow sun. The same stars wheeling overhead in their patient circles. But the world below would have felt much larger then, and much stranger, and far less mapped. To travel from one great city to another could take months. A traveler might walk dusty roads for weeks, cross seas in small wooden ships, and arrive somewhere they had only heard about in whispered stories. And in that ancient world, certain places drew travelers from every direction, not because they were practical, not because they offered shelter or food, but because they were wonders. Stones piled higher than any mountain a person might think to build. Statues so large their feet looked like cliffs. Lighthouses whose flames could be seen from the deep sea. Gardens that seemed to float in the air above the desert. We call them today the 7 wonders of the ancient world. A short, quiet list. 7 names written down long ago of places a person was meant to see before they died. Most of them are gone now. 6 of the 7 have crumbled into dust, or sunk into harbors, or burned, or fallen in slow earthquakes that no living person remembers. Only one still stands in the desert outside modern Cairo, weathered and worn and patient, the way it has been for more than 4,000 years. And here is the gentle puzzle we will sit with tonight. We do not entirely know how much of this list is real. We do not fully know how the wonders were built, or where some of them actually stood, or what they truly looked like in the soft light of their own time. We have fragments, pieces of marble, a few cracked descriptions written by travelers who saw them with their own eyes. Some drawings made hundreds of years after the wonders had already fallen. And a great deal of beautiful, uncertain memory. Some of the wonders are well attested. The Great Pyramid of Giza is still there, still measurable, still studied stone by stone. The Mausoleum at Halikarnassos left enough rubble that archaeologists have traced its outline. The Lighthouse of Alexandria left blocks resting on the sea floor, scattered by old earthquakes, waiting in the green water of the harbor, but others slip through our fingers. The hanging gardens of Babylon may not even have been in Babylon at all. Some researchers wonder if they ever existed in the form we picture them. Other researchers believe they did exist, simply somewhere else or under another name. The question remains open. This is the quiet thread that ties our episode together. How much of the ancient wonders is myth? How much is record? And which of them are we still slowly, gently rediscovering even now? Divers descend into harbors and find old carved stone. Satellites scan the desert and reveal soft shapes in the sand. Old texts get translated again with fresh eyes, and a single new word can change what we thought we knew. The list is not closed. It is, in a way, still being written. Picture the 7 of them standing in their own places, in their own times. A great pyramid casting a long blue shadow over the desert at dusk. A garden terrace dripping with vines. Somewhere in the warm, dry air of old Mesopotamia. A bronze giant rising above a harbor, the sun catching its shoulders. A lighthouse with a fire burning at its top, visible far out at sea. A marble temple to a goddess, columns rising into the morning mist. A tomb for a king, carved by the finest sculptors of the age. A seated statue of a god, ivory and gold gleaming in lamplight inside a quiet sanctuary. They did not all stand at the same moment. The list spans centuries. Some had already fallen before others were even built. But together, they form a kind of soft constellation, a pattern of human awe scattered across the old Mediterranean world. Over the next many hours, we will visit each of them in turn. Slowly, gently, we will look at what we know and at what we do not know, and at the questions that still hang in the air like dust in a sunbeam. There is no hurry tonight. The wonders have been patient for thousands of years. They can wait a little longer while you drift. Before we wander any further into the soft fog of these old stories, it helps to know what the list actually is and how it came to us. The 7 wonders of the ancient world is not a single document carved into a temple wall. It is not a royal decree. It is, instead, a quiet idea that drifted through the writings of Greek travelers and poets, slowly taking shape over hundreds of years. The Greek word they used was themata. It meant things worth seeing. Later, that word softened into thaumata, which meant wonders or marvels. So the list was, at first, less of an official ranking and more of a kind of ancient travel guide, a whisper passed between scholars about which sites, scattered around the eastern Mediterranean, a curious person ought to behold at least once before they died. The list we know today gathers 7 specific places: the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, somewhere in old Mesopotamia, the statue of Zeus at Olympia in Greece, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus on the coast of what is now Turkey, the Mausoleum at Halikarnassos, also along that same coast, the Colossus of Rhodes on a Greek island, and the Lighthouse of Alexandria on the northern shore of Egypt. All 7 sat within a fairly small circle of the world, as the ancient Greeks knew it. A traveler with time and money could, in theory, visit them all. The farthest 2 were perhaps 1,500 miles apart, which is roughly the distance from New York to Denver. Not the whole planet, just one warm, dry, sun-soaked corner of it. The ages of these wonders varied enormously. The Great Pyramid was already ancient when the list was being written. It had been standing for more than 2,000 years by then, older to the Greeks than the Greeks themselves are to us. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, by contrast, was almost brand new. It was built in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and it would have still felt fresh and gleaming when the early lists were drawn up. So the 7 wonders were never built together, never planned together, never even seen by all the same eyes. They span more than 2,000 years of human effort, gathered into one list by people who simply admired what other people long ago had managed to make. The earliest written hints of the list come from Greek writers around the 2nd century before the Common Era. A poet named Antipater of Sidon wrote a short verse praising the great sights of his world. His list is close to the one we use today, though not identical. He included the walls of Babylon rather than the lighthouse, since the lighthouse was new and perhaps not famous enough. Other writers offered their own slightly different lists. Some included a great altar. Some included different temples. The list we now treat as final only settled into its familiar shape much later, during the European Renaissance, when scholars looked back at the old texts and chose the version that felt most complete. This means something quiet and important. The 7 wonders, as we name them today, are partly a memory of memory, a list of a list, a choice made by later readers about which ancient choices to honor. And so, the very idea of the 7 carries within it a small, soft uncertainty from the very beginning. 6 of the 7 are now gone. Only the Great Pyramid of Giza still stands in something close to its original form. The other 6 have crumbled, burned, fallen, or vanished so completely that we are not even sure where some of them once stood. The Hanging Gardens, in particular, have never been found by archaeologists, and some researchers wonder whether they existed in the place the old stories say they did. We will return to that gentle puzzle later. For tonight, hold this picture in your mind. A handful of Greek travelers 2,000 years ago, sitting by lamplight, writing down the names of buildings they had seen or heard about. A pyramid that already felt impossibly old. Gardens that climbed into the air. A bronze giant the size of a modern apartment building. A lighthouse taller than most cathedrals. A statue of a god so vast that visitors said it seemed to lift the roof of its temple. These were the things they decided that were worth seeing, the things worth remembering, the things worth writing down before time washed them away. And time did wash them away. Slowly, gently, almost completely. What we have left are fragments, broken stones, faded descriptions, and a handful of drawings made by people who never actually saw them. From these quiet pieces, we try to imagine the whole. Of all the 7 wonders the old writers named, only one is still standing: the Great Pyramid of Giza. It sits on a flat stone plateau on the west bank of the Nile, just outside what is now Cairo. The desert around it is pale gold, and the pyramid rises from that gold like a quiet mountain made by human hands. To understand it, we have to go back about 4,500 years already old. The pyramid was built for a king named Khufu. He ruled during what scholars call the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom. His reign lasted somewhere between 23 and 46 years, depending on which ancient source you trust. Even that simple fact, the length of his life as a king, is something we are not fully sure about. The records from that long ago are thin, broken, and sometimes copied centuries later by other hands. What is certain is that during his rule, a vast project began on the Giza Plateau. Workers cut limestone blocks from quarries nearby. They floated harder, finer stone down the Nile from places far to the south. Granite came from Aswan, almost 500 miles upriver. Each block weighed tons. The largest, deep inside the structure, weigh as much as 80 tons. Together, the pyramid contains roughly 2.5 million blocks of stone. The finished shape rose to about 481 feet. For nearly 4,000 years, until cathedrals went up in medieval Europe, it was the tallest thing humans had ever built. Picture that for a moment. 40 centuries of being the tallest. Empires rose and fell in its shadow. The Nile shifted its course. The desert wind kept polishing its sides, and still it stood. How exactly the workers built it is one of the gentlest, oldest mysteries we have. One long-standing idea is that they used long, straight ramps of mud brick and rubble to drag the blocks up the growing sides. Another theory says the ramps spiraled around the pyramid as it rose. A more recent idea, based on a strange passage discovered in a nearby quarry, suggests there may have been ramps built inside the pyramid itself, hidden in the core. Each theory explains some of the evidence and leaves other pieces unexplained. None of them has won the full agreement of scholars. Even more curious are the spaces hidden inside the stone. The pyramid has at least 3 known chambers. There is a lower chamber cut into the bedrock below the structure. There is a middle chamber, sometimes called the Queen's Chamber, though no queen was ever found there. And there is the King's Chamber, lined with smooth red granite, with a single empty stone box inside. Above the King's Chamber sit 5 stacked spaces with thick granite beams between them. Scholars think these were built to to spread the weight of the stone above, so the ceiling would not collapse. But there are also long, narrow shafts cutting through the pyramid at sharp angles, rising from the inner chambers toward the outer surface. Some researchers think these shafts had a spiritual purpose, perhaps to let the king's spirit travel toward certain stars. Others think they were used for airflow during construction. The honest answer is that we are still wondering. In recent years, a project called Scan Pyramids used a technique borrowed from particle physics. By measuring tiny particles called muons that fall constantly from the sky and pass through solid stone, the team could map the inside of the pyramid without drilling a single hole. In 2017, they announced something quiet and astonishing. There appears to be a large, empty space, nearly 100 feet long, sitting above the grand gallery. No one has been inside it. No one knows what it holds, or whether it holds anything at all. It may be a structural void left on purpose. It may be a sealed corridor. It may be something else entirely. The question is still open. So the oldest of the 7 wonders, the only one still with us, is also still keeping secrets. We can stand at its base and touch the same limestone the ancient workers touched. We can measure it down to the inch. We can scan through its walls with cosmic particles, and yet the simple questions remain. How exactly did they lift the stones? Why those shafts at those angles? What is inside the hidden space above the gallery? The pyramid has been waiting in the desert for 45 centuries, calm and patient, and it has not finished telling us its story. Tonight, while you rest, picture that quiet shape against the soft evening sky, holding its old questions inside the warm stone. If you stand close to the Great Pyramid and run your hand along its base, you feel something the photographs never quite show. The stones are not small. Each block of the outer core weighs somewhere between 2 and 3 tons. Many of the inner blocks weigh far more, and yet they sit against one another with seams so fine that in places you could not slide a thin blade between them. The pyramid is built mostly of limestone. Limestone is a soft, pale rock made from the bodies of tiny sea creatures that lived in shallow oceans long ago. Their shells fell to the seafloor, layer upon layer, over millions of years, they pressed together into stone. The plateau at Giza is, in a sense, an old ocean floor lifted into the sun. When the builders cut their blocks from the nearby quarries, they were cutting through the memory of a vanished sea. The smooth outer casing, now mostly gone, was a finer white limestone brought from Tura across the river. It once made the pyramid shine like a still flame in the desert light. Travelers from far away wrote that the sides looked polished, as if the whole mountain were dressed in pale silk. Most of that casing was stripped away in later centuries to build other walls in other cities. Only a few stones near the top of a neighbor pyramid still hint at how bright the surface once was. Inside the structure, the builders used a different stone for the most important rooms. The king's chamber is lined with massive blocks of red granite hauled from Aswan, far up the Nile. Granite is a hard, crystalline rock, born deep in the earth, where heat and pressure cooked it slowly into a mosaic of pink feldspar, gray quartz, and dark flecks of mica. Some of these granite beams above the chamber weigh as much as 60 or 70 tons. How they were lifted into place, hundreds of feet above the desert floor, is still an open question. One theory is that the builders used long ramps of mud brick and rubble, winding up the sides of the pyramid as it grew. Another theory suggests internal ramps, spiraling inside the structure itself, hidden in the unfinished core. A third idea, gentler and slower, Imagine's counterweights and wooden sleds, and water poured on sand to ease the friction. There is some evidence for each. There is not yet a single, complete answer. The strangeness deepens when you think about where these stones come from in a longer sense. The limestone around Giza was once living tissue, plankton and coral and shell. The granite at Aswan cooled from molten rock pushed up from deep inside the planet. The iron tools that may have shaped some of the harder cuts in later eras contain iron atoms forged inside ancient stars that died long before our sun was born. Every block in the pyramid carries a history older than the pharaohs by an almost unimaginable margin. The water that softened the sand, the air that cooled the workers, even the salt in their sweat, all of it traces back to processes far beyond the quarry. Some researchers believe much of Earth's water arrived on icy comets and dust grains during the planet's early years. Others think most of it was already locked inside the rocks that formed our world and slowly steamed out through volcanoes. The truth may be a quiet blend of both. The Nile that floated the granite barges began, in some sense, in places no human eye has ever seen. There is one more puzzle in the stones themselves. The fit is so precise in certain interior passages that it has invited wonder for centuries. Some have wondered if the Egyptians used a form of cast stone, a kind of poured limestone concrete, for parts of the structure. Most geologists who have studied the blocks closely disagree. They see the natural grain of quarried rock, the small fossils, the bedding lines that match nearby cliffs. Still, the question of exactly how each surface was dressed to such tight tolerances, using copper tools and patient hands, remains partly open. It is easy to imagine the quarry workers at dusk, dust on their arms, sitting beside a freshly cut block and resting their palms on stone that was once a sea. They could not have known that the limestone held the bodies of creatures from 100 million years before them. They could not have known that the granite held minerals shaped in the slow furnaces deep below. They only knew the weight of it, the coolness of it in the evening, and the work that waited in the morning. The stones, quietly, knew far more. Of all the 7 wonders, the hanging gardens may be the strangest. Strange because we have descriptions of them. Strange because we have stories. And strange because, after centuries of searching, no one has ever found them in the ground. The ancient writers spoke of green terraces rising into the dry sky of Mesopotamia. They described trees growing high above the city, watered by some clever, hidden machine. They wrote of vines spilling over stone ledges, of flowers blooming where the desert wind blew hot and dry. The gardens were said to climb upward like a soft green hill made by human hands. And yet, when archaeologists dig in the ruins of old Babylon, they find no clear trace of them, no terraced foundations, no long water channels rising to a great height, no garden soil layered into the brickwork of the palace. The city itself is well known. Its walls have been mapped. Its gates have been uncovered. But the gardens, if they ever stood there, have left no firm fingerprint in the dust. This is where the forces at work become the heart of the mystery. To grow a tall garden in that part of the world, the builders would have needed to fight several invisible enemies at once. The first was gravity. Water is heavy. To lift it from a river to the top of a high stone terrace, you need pressure, lifting power, and patience. Some ancient sources describe a screw-like device, a long spiral inside a tube, turned by hand or by animal, that pulled water upward as it spun. Others describe chains of buckets, rising and falling in a slow loop, each one carrying a small share of the river toward the sky. The second force was heat. The sun in southern Iraq is fierce. It bakes mud brick. It cracks stone. It pulls water from leaves faster than most plants can drink. To keep a high garden alive, the soil would have needed constant watering, and the roots would have needed deep, cool beds to shelter in. Some descriptions speak of thick layers of reed and tar laid beneath the soil to hold the water in and keep the brick below from softening. Others speak of stone roofs sealed against leaks so that the wet earth above did not slowly dissolve the palace below. The third force was the slow weight of the soil itself. A garden tall enough to be called a wonder would press down on its own foundations with enormous force. The stone beams would have needed to be strong. The columns would have needed to be thick. And every season of rain, every shake of the ground, every warm, wet summer would have tested the bond between the brick and the binder. Mud brick, the common building stone of Babylon, does not love water. It softens, it crumbles, it returns to mud. A garden built on mud brick would have been a quiet, constant battle against its own design. So the question becomes a careful one. Could such a structure have stood in Babylon at all? One view says yes. The Babylonians were skilled engineers. They knew how to move water through long canals. They knew how to build tall ziggurats, those stepped towers that rose above the flat plain. Adding green terraces to a palace in this view was a difficult but possible step further. Another view is more cautious. It points out that no Babylonian text from the time of King Nebuchadnezzar, who supposedly built the gardens, ever mentions them. The Greek writers who described them lived centuries later and far away. A third view, gaining quiet support among some researchers, suggests the gardens were not in Babylon at all. They may have stood in the city of Nineveh, far to the north, built by an Assyrian king named Sennacherib. Nineveh had aqueducts. Nineveh had carved stone reliefs showing trees on raised terraces. Nineveh had a real, traceable water system that climbed across the land. Perhaps the legend traveled south over the centuries, and the wrong city took the credit. Or perhaps the gardens stood in both places, in different forms, and memory blended them into one. Or perhaps the gardens, as described, never quite existed as a single thing, only as a soft, growing memory of many green walls and many clever pumps, gathered into one beautiful story. For tonight, we can let them be exactly what they are: a green shape in the imagination, a pale terrace climbing into a warm Mesopotamian sky, a garden we cannot point to, cannot date, cannot photograph, a wonder shaped as much by forgotten engineers as by the slow forces that may, in the end, have quietly carried it away. To picture the hanging gardens, we first have to picture the city that may have held them. And old Babylon was not a small place. It was, for its time, one of the largest cities on earth. When we say the gardens may have hung somewhere inside its walls, we are talking about a city so vast that finding a single garden inside it would be like searching for one specific courtyard in a sprawling modern capital, with most of the streets buried under centuries of dust. Babylon sat along the Euphrates River in what is now central Iraq. The river ran straight through the heart of the city, splitting it in two. Imagine a wide, slow brown river, lined with date palms, carrying boats made of reed and pitch. The water moved gently, warm in the sun, cool in the shade of the bridges. The city drank from this river. It bathed in it. It fed its fields with it. And if the old stories are right, it lifted that same water high into the sky to feed a garden of trees. The walls around Babylon are the part historians argue about most when it comes to scale. The Greek writer Herodotus, who lived in the 5th century before the Common Era, claimed the outer walls stretched for about 56 miles. He said they were wide enough on top for 2 4-horse chariots to pass each other. If those numbers were true, the walls of Babylon would have been wider than many modern highways and longer than the distance between many neighboring towns today. Later researchers think Herodotus exaggerated. Modern estimates put the inner city walls at closer to 11 miles around. Still enormous. Still hard to walk in a single afternoon. Even the smaller number is hard to feel in your body. 11 miles of wall is roughly the distance of a long morning run, but built in baked mud brick, rising several stories high, thick enough at the base that small rooms were tucked inside. To walk the full circuit of those inner walls at a slow, easy pace would take you most of a day. And every step of that day, the wall would still be standing beside you, taller than a house, older than almost anything you have ever touched. Inside the walls, the city held perhaps 200,000 people at its peak. In the time of King Nebuchadnezzar II, around 2,600 years ago. That was, in its day, one of the most crowded places on Earth. Streets of packed earth, flat-roofed homes of sun-dried brick, the smell of bread, of river mud, of animals, of smoke from cooking fires. Somewhere in that maze, the legend says, water climbed upward into green leaves. To understand the strangeness of that, think about your own kitchen sink. The water comes up because pipes hidden in the walls are pressurized by pumps somewhere far away. In ancient Babylon, there were no electric pumps. There were no closed pipes under pressure. To raise water from the Euphrates to the top of a stepped garden, perhaps 70 or 80 feet in the air, someone would have needed a clever machine, chains of buckets, a great screw turned by oxen or by human hands. Whatever it was, it had to run all day, every day, just to keep the leaves from wilting in the desert heat. And the heat in Babylon was, and still is, intense. Summer temperatures in that region climb above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The air is dry. The sun is heavy. A leafy garden in that climate is a kind of small miracle. It demands gallons upon gallons of water. somewhere solved that problem. Or it means somebody told a very convincing story. The river itself has shifted over the centuries. The Euphrates does not run today exactly where it ran in Nebuchadnezzar's time. Its banks have moved. Old channels have dried up. New ones have been carved. This means that even when archaeologists dig in the right city, they may be digging on the wrong side of where the water once flowed. A garden built to drink from a river is only as findable as the memory of that river's old path. So when we try to feel the scale of Babylon, we are really feeling the scale of a puzzle. A huge city, long walls, a wide, wandering river, hundreds of thousands of people, and somewhere among all of that, perhaps a few stone terraces with roots reaching down through the bricks. We cannot yet say exactly where. We can only stand at the edge of the map and wonder. Step softly into the temple at Olympia in the quiet of an evening more than 2,000 years ago. The doors are open just enough to let a low golden light spill onto the marble floor. Inside, the air is warm and still, scented with olive oil and the faint smoke of lamps that burn in shallow bronze dishes. The walls rise high into shadow, and there, at the far end of the long hall, sits the figure that travelers crossed seas to see. The statue of Zeus, carved and shaped by the sculptor Phidias, watches the room from his great throne. He is enormous. Ancient writers tell us he sat about 12 meters tall, nearly 40 feet, which means his head almost brushed the temple ceiling. The old joke among visitors was that if Zeus ever stood up, he would lift the roof clean off. His seated body filled the far end of the building like a quiet mountain made of ivory and gold. The skin of his arms, his chest, his calm bearded face, all of it was carved from pale ivory, polished until it glowed softly in the lamplight. The ivory came from elephant tusks, fitted together with great skill, so the seams almost vanished. His robe was different. The robe was beaten gold, hammered into thin sheets, and laid across a wooden frame beneath. The gold caught every flicker of flame and turned it into a slow, moving shimmer. When the lamps swayed in a draft, the robe seemed to ripple, as if cloth were really folding around the god's legs. Into the gold, ancient writers say, were set images of lilies and small animals worked in fine detail. Glass and gemstones were pressed into the surface here and there, so the eye kept finding new sparks the longer it looked. The throne itself was its own wonder. It rose behind him in dark cedar wood, but the wood was almost hidden under layers of ivory, ebony, gold, and inlaid stones. Painted figures decorated the panels between its legs. Small carved sphinxes crouched beneath the armrests, holding up the weight of the god. Above his head, on the back of the throne, sat carved figures of the graces and the seasons, watching down over his shoulders. Every surface had something to study, something to wonder about. In his right hand, Zeus held a small figure of Nike, the spirit of victory, also made of ivory and gold. She seemed to stand calmly on his open palm. In his left hand, he gripped a long scepter, and on top of that scepter perched an eagle, carved so finely that travelers wrote of it as if it might lift off at any moment. His sandals were said to be gold. His beard was long and curling. His eyes, some sources suggest, were painted or inlaid with darker stone, fixed on something far beyond the temple walls. In front of the statue lay a shallow pool. The pool was filled not with water, but with olive oil. The oil served a quiet purpose. It kept the ivory from drying and cracking in the warm air, and it reflected the lamps overhead, sending a second soft glow back up onto the god's chest and face. Imagine the slow shimmer of that oil, mirroring the golden robe, doubling every lamp flame, painting the lower half of the statue in a wavering second light. We know much of this from ancient writers like Pausanias, who walked into the temple and described what he saw. Yet here the mystery begins to settle in. No one alive today has stood in front of the real statue. It is long gone. We have descriptions, a few coins that show a small image of the god on his throne, and later artists' guesses. The exact look of his face, the precise pattern of the lilies on his robe, the true color of the gemstones. All of these slip between record and imagination. Some scholars believe the descriptions we have are careful and largely accurate. Others wonder if Pausanias and the writers before him added a little awe of their own, smoothing rough edges, polishing what was already polished. The statue may have been even more strange and ornate than we picture, or perhaps a little plainer, with more wood showing through. We simply cannot know. So when you imagine the Zeus of Olympia tonight, picture him as the ancients tried to picture him for us. A vast seated figure of ivory and gold, lit by oil lamps, mirrored in a still pool, watching the temple in silence. And let the small uncertainties drift in the warm air around him, because those uncertainties are part of the wonder, too. Beneath the temple floor at Olympia, in the soft Greek soil, archaeologists once found something quiet and remarkable. They found a workshop, not a grand hall, not a treasury, not a tomb. A simple working space where more than 2,000 years ago, a sculptor named Phidias is believed to have built the great statue of Zeus. The discovery came slowly in the middle of the 20th century as diggers brushed away centuries of dust and silt. And what they uncovered told a story almost as moving as the statue itself. The building stood just west of the temple of Zeus. Its shape and size matched the inner room of the temple, so the sculptor could test how his giant figure would look in its final home. Inside this workshop, the team found bits of ivory, slivers of bone, scraps of glass, small lumps of lead. They found molds for shaping thin sheets of gold. They found tools, broken and worn, the kind a craftsman uses for years, and then sets aside. They found terracotta forms that may have helped curve the robe of the god. And most touching of all, they found a small black cup with a name scratched into its base. The letters spelled out in Old Greek, "I belong to Phidias." That little cup, if it truly was his, gives us a thread back through the dark. It places a human hand on the workshop floor. It says that someone drank from this clay, set it down, and went on with his work. The statue is gone. The temple is gone, but the cup remains. What we do not know is exactly how the workshop functioned day by day. We can guess at the scale of the labor, but we cannot see it. We do not know how many helpers Phidias had. We do not know how the ivory was softened, though one old theory says it was soaked in beer or in vinegar to make it bend. Another theory says it was steamed, truth is, no clear ancient record survives that explains the method. The technique died with the people who used it. We also do not know the order of the building. Did the sculptor start with the head, gazing down from the rafters of the workshop? Did he start with the throne, that great chair carved with painted figures and inlaid with stones? Did he work outward from a wooden core, layering ivory like skin and gold like cloth? Each idea has supporters. Each idea has gaps. The workshop floor holds clues, but it does not hold answers. The depths of this story go further still. Beneath the workshop, beneath the temple, beneath the soil of Olympia, the ground itself has shifted across the centuries. Rivers have changed their paths. The Cladios and the Alpheos have flooded the sanctuary again and again, burying the stones in layers of clay and gravel. Some scholars believe that meters of silt now cover parts of the old site, hiding objects that have never been seen by modern eyes. The depths keep their secrets patiently. There is a quiet idea worth sitting with. The workshop was, in a way, a hidden twin of the temple. Above the floor stood the public wonder, gleaming in lamplight, watched by pilgrims who had walked for weeks to see it. Below or beside, in the working room, the same shape took form in rough wood and raw material. The wonder above could not exist without the dust below. And when the wonder was lost, the dust remained. Centuries after Phidias, the workshop took on a new life. In late Roman times, the building was rebuilt as a small Christian church. Its walls held up. Its floor was reused. The space that once held a pagan god in pieces was now a place of quiet prayer. That layering, that reuse, is part of why the workshop survived to be found at all. If it had been left empty, it might have crumbled with the rest of the sanctuary. Instead, it was kept standing by people who did not know what had once happened inside it. So this section of our wandering ends below the floor, not above it. The great gold and ivory Zeus is gone, melted, or burned, or carried away, and no one can say for sure where. But the workshop is still there. The cup is still there. The molds, the chips, the tools are still there, resting in museum drawers. They are small things. They are also, in their small way, the closest we can get to standing beside the sculptor in the soft afternoon light. We do not know how he worked. We only know that he did. On the western coast of what is now Turkey, near the ancient city of Ephesus, there once stood a temple so large and so beautiful that travelers said it outshone every other holy place in the known world. It was the temple of Artemis, built for the goddess of the hunt and the moon. And like the moon she watched over, the temple itself moved through cycles. It was built, destroyed, and built again more than once, across many hundreds of years. The earliest temple on that spot was a humble thing, a small shrine, perhaps, set on marshy ground near a slow river that wound down to the sea. Pilgrims came to leave offerings of bronze and ivory and small carved animals. Over time, the shrine grew. The people of Ephesus loved their goddess, and they wanted her house to match their love. So they began to build larger and larger still. By the 6th century before our era, the temple had become something extraordinary. It stood on a wide marble platform, ringed by more than 100 tall columns. Each column rose nearly 20 meters into the sky, carved with care, topped with delicate stone curls. The roof was made of cedar beams. The doors, some old accounts say, were of cypress wood polished smooth. Inside, in the cool half-light, stood the statue of Artemis herself, draped in symbols no one today fully understands. Then came fire. On a summer night in the year 356 before our era, a man set the temple alight. His reasons remain a puzzle. The ancient writers said he wanted his name remembered forever. And so, the people of Ephesus passed a law forbidding anyone to speak it aloud. Whether that law truly silenced him or only made the story stranger is itself an open question. What we do know is that the great temple, with its painted ceilings and its tall white columns, burned through the night and fell into ruin. But the cycle did not end there. The people of Ephesus chose to build again. The new temple, raised over the ashes of the old one, was even larger. Some accounts say it took more than a century to complete. The columns rose higher. The platform spread wider. Sculptors carved figures into the bases of the columns, scenes of gods and heroes, worn smooth now by time. Travelers who saw this second temple wrote that no words could match it. One ancient writer claimed it made even the pyramids seem ordinary. Whether that was true praise or simply the warmth of a wandering poet, we cannot say. The second temple stood for hundreds of years. Pilgrims still came. Coins were minted with its image. Then, slowly, the cycle turned again. Earthquakes shook the coast. Raiders passed through. The marshy ground beneath the temple shifted and softened. The river that fed the harbor began to fill with silt, and the harbor itself crept farther from the city each century. Ephesus, once a great port, found itself slowly stranded inland. The temple, too, was abandoned in stages. Stones were taken away to build other things. Columns toppled. Mud rose around the broken marble. By the time travelers came looking for the temple in later centuries, almost nothing remained above the ground. For a long while, no one was certain where it had even stood. The cycle of building and falling and forgetting had run its full course. Then, in the 1800s, an English engineer searched the marshes for years, sinking probes into the soft earth. He found fragments at last, deep beneath the waterlogged ground. The platform was still there, swallowed by mud and silence. Today, only a single reconstructed column stands at the site, pieced together from broken stones. Storks sometimes nest on its top. Around it, frogs sing in the wet grass. What we still do not know is how the second temple truly looked in its full glory. The ancient descriptions disagree. Some say the columns numbered 127. Others give different counts. Some say the inner statue was made of ebony. Others say gold. Some accounts speak of paintings inside. Others describe only carved stone. Each writer saw a different temple in a different season with different light. So the rhythm of the temple of Artemis is a rhythm of building and ruin, of memory and forgetting, of marsh water rising and falling around the same patient stones. It rose, it burned, it rose again. It fell at last into the soft ground. And somewhere beneath that ground, much of it is still waiting quietly for the next turn of the cycle to bring it back into the light. Artemis did not stand alone on a high, dry hill. It rose from a low coastal plain near the mouth of a slow river called the Castros, where fresh water met the sea in a wide, soft delta. The land around it was green and damp, full of reeds and birds and the slow movement of silt. To understand the temple, you have to understand the wet ground beneath it and the marshes that pressed in from every side. Ephesus itself was a port city. Ships came in from the Aegean, carrying oil and wine, and travelers from far places. The harbor was busy, the streets were full, and the temple stood as the calm heart of it all. But the sea and the river were always moving. The river carried dirt down from the hills. The dirt settled in the harbor. The harbor grew shallow, year by year, season by season. The people of Ephesus dredged it again and again, trying to keep the water deep enough for ships. The temple was built on this soft, wet ground for a reason. One ancient writer said the builders chose the marsh on purpose because they believed the soft earth would absorb the shaking of earthquakes. The region was known for its tremors. A stone temple set on hard rock might crack and fall. A temple set on damp clay might sway and survive. So the builders dug down through the wet ground and laid a foundation of charcoal and fleeces, packed tight to spread the weight of the marble above. Whether this clever trick actually worked, or whether it only delayed the inevitable, is still a quiet question. The marshes shaped the temple in other ways. The reeds and pools were home to herons and frogs and small fish. Pilgrims walking the road to the sanctuary would have passed through a soft, humming green world. The air smelled of mud and salt and flowers. In the heat of summer, mist rose off the water at dawn. In winter, the rains made the paths thick and slow. The goddess worshipped there, Artemis of Ephesus, was tied to wild places, to forests and animals, and the edges where land became something else. The marsh felt like her kind of ground. But the same marsh that protected the temple from earthquakes also worked against it in slower ways. The wet earth shifted. The columns sank ever so slightly over the centuries. The river kept depositing silt. Layer by layer, the land around the temple rose, while the temple itself stayed put. By the time the sanctuary was finally abandoned. After centuries of damage and rebuilding, the ruins began to disappear under the very ground that had once cradled them. This is why finding the temple of Artemis took so long. By the 1800s, no one knew exactly where it stood. The harbor of Ephesus had silted up completely. The sea had retreated several miles. The river had wandered, choosing new paths through the soft land. The whole coastline had moved. A city that was once a busy port now sat inland, surrounded by fields and quiet villages. The temple lay buried under layers of mud, hidden beneath water and reeds. A British engineer named John Turtlewood searched for it for years in the 1860s, digging trial pits across the plain, following old roads and inscriptions. When he finally found the foundation, it was many feet below the modern ground level, soaked in groundwater. Excavators had to pump constantly just to see what they had uncovered. Even today, the site where the temple once stood is often a shallow pool, with a single reconstructed column rising from the water, ringed by frogs and tall grass. This is the puzzle of neighbors. The marsh helped build the temple, then helped destroy the city around it, then helped hide the ruins from history. The river carried the silt. The silt killed the harbor. The dying harbor weakened the city. The weakened city could no longer protect its great sanctuary. Each piece pulled on the next, slow and patient, over 1,000 years. How much of the temple still lies beneath that wet ground, untouched, waiting to be lifted from the mud? Archaeologists have found foundation stones, fragments of column drums, pieces of carved marble. But the soft earth has surely swallowed more than it has given back. Whether the deepest layers still hold offerings, statues, or older shrines beneath the marble temple is a question no one can fully answer. The marsh keeps its secrets gently, in cool water and dark clay, while the reeds whisper overhead in the slow wind. On a windy hillside in what is now southwestern Turkey, in a city the Greeks called Halikarnassos, there once stood a tomb so grand it gave its name to every great tomb that followed. We still use the word today. A mausoleum. The original belonged to a man named Mausolus, a regional ruler who governed a small corner of the Persian Empire in the 4th century before the Common Era. When he died, his wife Artemisia, who was also his sister, set out to build him a resting place unlike any other. What she finished, with the help of the finest sculptors of the Greek world, became one of the 7 wonders. The extremes of the mausoleum are quiet, but they are real. By most ancient accounts, it rose somewhere near 140 feet into the air. That is taller than a 12-story building. For a tomb, not for a temple, not for a palace, not for a fortress, for a single grave. Ancient writers tell us it stood on a tall stone base with 36 columns ringing a central chamber, and above those columns, a stepped pyramid of 24 shallow stairs. At the very top, perched against the open sky, stood a marble chariot pulled by 4 marble horses, with statues of Mausoleum and Artemisia riding inside. The whole thing was white, smooth, and visible from far out at sea. Among the 7 wonders, the mausoleum holds a strange record. It is the only one named for a person who was not a god, not a hero, not a legend. The others honored Zeus, or Artemis, or Helios the sun, or the work of pharaohs and kings remembered as larger than life. The mausoleum honored a regional governor of a mid-sized coastal town. That alone is worth sitting with. Somehow, the tomb of a minor ruler became famous enough, beautiful enough, and strange enough to stand beside the Great Pyramid in the imagination of the ancient world. It also held a record for sculpture. Ancient sources tell us that 4 of the most celebrated sculptors of the age each took one side of the tomb. Their names come down to us as Scopas, Bryaxis, Timotheos, and Leochares. Each carved his own wall of figures. Whether they truly worked in friendly rivalry, or whether that detail is a later embellishment, we cannot say. What we do know is that the surviving fragments, now scattered in museums, show carving of remarkable skill. Battles between Greeks and Amazons, lions in mid-stride, horses with flaring nostrils, robes that seem to move in a wind that stopped blowing 24 centuries ago. The mausoleum also stood longer than most of the other wonders. The Colossus fell within decades. The Lighthouse crumbled over centuries of tremors. The statue of Zeus was carried off and lost, but the mausoleum endured, more or less intact, for around 1600 years. It watched the rise of Alexander, the fall of Persia, the spread of Rome, the slow drift of empires across the Mediterranean. Earthquakes came and went, and the tomb still stood. Some travelers in the medieval period still wrote about seeing parts of it upright on its hill. Its end came slowly, through a long sequence of quakes that loosened the columns and shook the chariot from the sky. By the time the Knights of St. John arrived in the 15th century and began building a nearby castle, the mausoleum lay in pieces on the ground. The knights used the smooth white marble for their walls. Many of the carved figures were burned for lime, the ancient way of making mortar. Only a small number were saved, set into the castle walls as decoration, where some still remain. Here is where the extremes turn into open questions. We know roughly how tall the mausoleum was, but not exactly. We know there were 36 columns, but the spacing and proportions are debated. We know it was crowned by a chariot, but the size, the pose, even the direction the horses faced, these things remain uncertain. Every modern reconstruction is a guess, an educated guess, built from a handful of ancient descriptions and the scattered fragments left behind. Drawings made over the last few centuries look confident, but no two agree. So the mausoleum sits in a strange place among the wonders. It was the most ordinary in its origin, a tomb for a small king. It became the most enduring in its fame, lending its name to every grand tomb that followed, and it remains one of the least certain in its true shape. The hilltop where it stood is now a quiet excavation, with low walls and a soft wind, and the silence of a record we will likely never fully recover. Now let us slow down and look closely at the mausoleum once more, not at its great roof, or its tall columns, or the chariot that may have crowned its top. Let us look instead at the small things, the quiet things, the carvings, the hands that shaped them, the tiny details that even the ancient writers paused to admire. The old records tell us that 4 sculptors worked on the mausoleum. Their names names have come down to us through the centuries: Bryaxis, Liachares, Scopas, Timotheus. Each one took a side of the tomb. Each one carved his own wall of figures. And the writers said that even after the king who paid them was dead, and the queen who loved him was dead, the sculptors kept working. They worked for the beauty of the thing itself. They worked, the old stories say, for their own glory among other artists. We do not know if this is fully true. It may be a touching tale added later, but the carvings that survive do show 4 different hands, 4 different ways of cutting stone. So perhaps the old story holds a real thread of memory. The marble they used came from quarries near the city. It was a soft white stone, the kind that takes a fine edge. Under close light, you can still see the tool marks, tiny chisel strokes, curved scrapes from a rounded blade, the faint hatching where a sculptor smoothed a thigh or a shoulder. These marks are small, smaller than a fingernail, but they hold the rhythm of a hand that moved more than 2,000 years ago. The figures on the friezes show battles: Greeks against Amazons, centaurs against men, horses rearing, cloaks flying, shields raised in slow stone. Look closely, and you find quiet details: a sandal strap, the small folds at the back of a knee, the curl of hair against a neck, a horse's open mouth, the teeth carved one by one. These were not meant to be seen up close. They sat high on the tomb, far above the eye of any visitor. And yet the sculptors carved them anyway, with the same care they would give to a face at arm's length. Why bother with such fine work, so far from any human gaze? This is one of the small mysteries that lingers around the mausoleum. Some scholars think the sculptors believed the gods would see what people could not. Others think it was simply pride. A good carver finishes the back of a figure, even when the back will face a wall. Still, others wonder if the friezes were painted in bright colors, and the fine cuts caught the paint in deeper shadows, making the figures seem to move in changing light. We do not know which idea is closest to the truth. Perhaps all 3 are true at once. The colors are themselves a quiet mystery. The mausoleum, like most Greek marble buildings, was almost certainly painted. Reds, blues, yellows, soft trick of time. The paint faded and washed away long ago. A few surviving fragments still hold traces of pigment in their tiny cracks. Under a microscope, you can sometimes see grains of old color clinging to the marble, like dust caught in a stone's pores. To stand before the finished tomb in its own time would have been to see something far more bright and far more strange than the calm white ruins we now imagine. The faces, too, hold small puzzles. One large head found among the rubble may be the face of King Mausoleum himself. It has heavy cheeks, a thick beard, a look that is not quite Greek and not quite Persian. Some scholars think this is a true portrait, carved from memory by a sculptor who had seen the king alive. Others think it is an idealized face, made up of features that suggested power without belonging to any one man. The marble does not tell us. It only holds the shape, patient and quiet, while we wonder. There are tiny details that almost no one notices. A drilled hole behind an ear where a bronze earring once hung. A faint groove along a sleeve where metal thread may have been pinned. A small mark on a base, perhaps a sculptor's signature, worn down by centuries of wind. These are the textures of a vanished workshop, the leftovers of fingers that knew exactly what they were doing. And so, on this quiet edge of the story, the mausoleum becomes something smaller and more human. Not a tomb of legend, but a building covered in the careful, patient marks of people who cared about their work, even when no one was watching. On the small Greek island of Rhodes, in the warm light of the eastern Mediterranean, there once stood a giant of bronze. We call it the Colossus. It was a statue of the sun god Helios, raised by the people of Rhodes in the early 3rd century before the Common Era. And almost everything we think we know about it comes from a handful of old writings, copied and recopied across 2,000 years. The story begins with a siege. A foreign army had come to Rhodes with great war machines, hoping to take the island. The siege failed. When the attackers left, they abandoned their bronze and iron weapons on the shore. The people of Rhodes melted them down. From that captured metal, they began to build a statue tall enough to thank their sun god for their survival. The statue took about 12 years to finish. The sculptor was a man named Charles of Lindos, a student of an earlier master. That much is recorded in several ancient sources, and most historians accept it as true. What is far less certain is what the Colossus actually looked like and where it actually stood. Our oldest detailed source is the Greek historian and traveler Strabo, who wrote about a century after the statue had already fallen. He never saw it standing. By his time, the Colossus had been knocked down by an earthquake and lay in great broken pieces on the ground. He described those pieces as enormous. He wrote that few people could wrap their arms around the thumb. He wrote that the inside was hollow, supported by iron and stone, but he did not tell us the pose. He did not tell us where exactly it had stood. A few decades later, the Roman writer Pliny the Elder added more. He gave a height of about 70 cubits, which most scholars translate to somewhere near 110 feet, or about 33 meters. He too described the fallen pieces, the hollow body, the iron framework inside. He too was writing long after the statue had crashed to earth. These two voices, Strabo and Pliny, are the main foundation of everything later writers have said. Every drawing, every painting, every wild guess across the centuries has been built on their few short paragraphs. And those paragraphs leave huge spaces empty. Medieval travelers passing through roads sometimes claimed to have seen remnants of the statue, though by then the bronze had long since been carried off and sold. Arab historians wrote that a merchant bought the broken pieces in the 7th century and loaded them onto hundreds of camels. Whether that story is exact or simply a folk memory, the metal was gone. Nothing of the body remained on the island to study. So when Renaissance artists in Europe began to imagine the Colossus, they were drawing from words alone. And one image took hold with extraordinary power. The statue was shown straddling the entrance to the harbor, 1 foot on each side, ships sailing between its legs. Engravings from the 16th and 17th centuries showed it this way again and again. The image became so familiar that many people still believe it today. But there is a quiet problem. No ancient source ever says the Colossus stood across the harbor. Strabo and Pliny do not describe such a pose. Engineers studying the question have pointed out that a hollow bronze figure of that height, with its legs spread wide over a harbor mouth, would have collapsed under its own weight long before it was finished. The harbor itself is also wider than the statue could have spanned. The straddling image is almost certainly a later invention, born in a different age, repeated until it felt like memory. So, where did the Colossus really stand? Some researchers suggest it rose on a hilltop overlooking the harbor, visible to ships approaching from far out at sea. Others suggest it stood on a stone breakwater at the harbor edge or near the gates of the city. A few have looked at the modern shoreline, where two medieval forts now guard the entrance, and wondered whether one of those forts sits on the old base. So far, no foundation has been found that everyone can agree on. Divers have searched the harbor floor. Surveys have mapped the seabed. Nothing certain has come up. The bronze is gone. The base, if it survives, is hidden under centuries of stone and water and rebuilding. So our knowledge of the Colossus comes to us through a strange chain. A few short paragraphs by two ancient writers, a long silence, a burst of imaginative drawings that gave the world a picture that may never have been real. And under all of it, an unanswered question about where exactly the giant once stood. The first surprise about the Colossus of Rhodes is something almost everyone gets wrong. For centuries, paintings and storybooks showed the bronze giant standing astride the harbor mouth, with 1 foot on each side, and great ships sailing between his legs. It is a beautiful image. It is also almost certainly impossible. The statue was very tall, perhaps 100 feet from base to crown, but its legs would have had to span a gap of several hundred feet. No bronze figure from the ancient world could have stretched that far without snapping under its own weight. So, if the harbor straddling pose is a later invention, where did the Colossus actually stand? The honest answer is that no one knows for certain. One leading theory places it on a stone pedestal beside the harbor entrance, perhaps on the breakwater, or on a low headland where ships could see it from far out at sea. Another idea places it further inland, near the temple district, the figure would have caught the morning sun. The ancient writers who described it did not always agree on the exact spot, and the city has been built over and rebuilt many times since. Here is another surprise. The Colossus was not solid bronze. A statue that size, cast in solid metal, would have weighed thousands of tons and collapsed under its own mass before it ever stood upright. Instead, the ancient accounts describe an inner framework of iron bars and stone blocks, with bronze plates fitted carefully over the outside like a shell. The sculptor, a man named Charles of Lindos, is said to have built the statue in pieces from the ground up, raising earth around each finished section so that the workers could keep climbing higher as the figure grew. When the statue was complete, the earth was cleared away and the giant stood revealed. That building method, if the ancient writers got it right, is itself remarkable. It means the Colossus was constructed inside a slowly rising hill of soil, like a sculpture buried in its own scaffolding. Workers would have moved up the mound day by day, hammering bronze plates into place, never seeing the whole figure until the very end. Some modern engineers find this story plausible. Others wonder whether wooden scaffolding would have been more practical, and whether the earth mound description was a poetic flourish added by later writers. The bronze itself raises questions. Where did so much metal come from? One ancient story says the people of Rhodes melted down the weapons and siege engines left behind by an invading army that had failed to take the city. The Colossus, in this telling, was built from the bronze of a defeated enemy, turned from instruments of war into a peaceful figure of the sun god Helios. It is a lovely story. It may also be partly true. Bronze was valuable and often recycled, and a city celebrating its survival might well have used captured metal in a monument of thanks. The statue stood for only about 54 years before an earthquake brought it down. The ancient writer Strabo says it broke at the knees and fell to the ground in great pieces. What surprises many people is what happened next. The Rhodians did not rebuild it. An oracle, according to one account, warned them not to raise the figure again. And so the broken bronze giant lay where it had fallen for centuries, travelers came from far away just to see the ruins. The fallen Colossus, lying in pieces on the ground, became almost as famous as the standing statue had been. Eventually, the bronze was sold off and carried away, melted down for other uses. One late account claims it took hundreds of camels to haul the metal from the island, though that detail may be exaggerated. Whatever the true amount, the great figure was scattered piece by piece into the wider world, perhaps reshaped into coins, tools, or smaller statues that no one today could recognize as fragments of a wonder. What remains strange is how little physical trace the Colossus left behind. No certain base has been found. No fragments have been identified. A statue that towered over a busy ancient harbor that drew visitors for centuries, even in ruins, has vanished so completely that scholars still argue about where it stood. The bronze giant lived a short life, fell, lay broken in plain sight for a very long time, and then dissolved into the ordinary metal of later ages. That, perhaps, is the deepest surprise. Something so vast and so famous can leave so faint a footprint. The Colossus is real in the records, real in the memory of the ancient world, and almost entirely absent from the ground beneath our feet. Picture the harbor of Alexandria as the sun begins to fall. The water turns from blue to copper, and the white stone of the city glows warm in the last light. At the mouth of the harbor, on a small island called Pharos, a tower rises higher than almost anything else in the ancient world. Sailors have been watching for it all day. Now, as the sky deepens, a flame is lit at the top. The lighthouse begins its other life, the life it lived at night. The lighthouse of Alexandria did not stand alone. It stood inside a web of things working together. The city below it had been planned by builders who understood wind, water, and trade. The harbor itself had been shaped to welcome ships from across the Mediterranean. And the tower was the final piece, the meeting point where sea, sky, fire, and human craft all touched at once. Think for a moment about everything that had to come together to make such a flame burn each night. Fuel had to be carried up the tower, possibly by donkeys walking a long spiral ramp structure. Some ancient writers describe such a ramp, though the details remain uncertain. Wood, oil, or resin was likely used, and each of these had to be grown, harvested, shipped, and stored. The lighthouse was the visible top of a long, quiet chain that reached back into forests and farms far from the sea. The light itself depended on the air. On clear nights, the flame could be seen many miles offshore. On foggy nights, even a great fire could vanish into the mist. The lighthouse worked with the weather, not against it. Sailors learned to read both the flame and the haze around it as a single message about what kind of night lay ahead. The tides played their part too. The eastern Mediterranean has gentle tides, smaller than those in the open ocean. This was one reason Alexandria could be such a busy harbor. Ships could come and go without fighting huge rises and falls of water. The lighthouse marked a coast that was, in its own quiet way, kinder to vessels than many others. The geology of the seabed, the shape of the Nile delta nearby, the slow drift of sand along the shore, all of these worked with the tower to make the harbor possible. And the Nile mattered more than anything. Each year, the great river flooded, then receded, leaving behind rich black soil. That soil fed the grain that filled the ships that sailed past the lighthouse. The flame at the top of the tower was, in a way, lit by the river. Without the Nile, there would have been no Alexandria worth guiding ships into. Without the lighthouse, the grain would have been harder to move. Each part needed the others. The stars also had a role. Ancient sailors used the night sky to find their way across open water. As they neared the Egyptian coast, the stars gave them a general direction, and the lighthouse gave them the exact place. One was vast and steady, set in the heavens. The other was made by human hands, set on a small island. Together, they guided ships home. The flame on Pharos was a small, warm answer to the cold pinpricks of starlight far above. There may have been a mirror at the top of the tower. Some ancient sources describe a polished surface that gathered the flame and threw it outward across the sea. Other sources do not mention it. We are not sure whether such a mirror existed, or what it was made of, or how well it worked. One idea is that bronze was polished until it caught the firelight. Another is that the mirror is a later legend, added to the tower's memory long after it fell. The question stays open. What we can say is that the lighthouse connected many systems at once. It joined fire to stone, stone to sea, sea to sky, sky to trade, trade to grain, grain to river, river to rain that fell far to the south in lands the people of Alexandria had never seen. Pull on any thread and the whole pattern shifts. A drought in the highlands could quiet the harbor. A storm at sea could darken the flame. A change in the wind could carry the smell of smoke far inland, where someone walking home in the dusk might pause and look toward the coast. The tower stood for many centuries. While it stood, it was a small, bright point inside a much larger living system. And the more we look at it, the more we see that no wonder of the ancient world ever stood by itself. Each one was held up by everything around it. The lighthouse at Alexandria did not stand still in time. Like all great structures, it changed. Its stones weathered. Its keepers came and went. Its flame, whatever shape that flame truly took, flickered through century after century, watched by sailors who were born and grew old and died, while the tower kept burning above the harbor. We do not know exactly how the light worked, and the answer almost certainly changed over the centuries. In the earliest years, when the tower was new, the fire at the top may have been a simple open flame, fed by wood hauled up through the interior. Ancient writers speak of a mirror or a polished sheet of metal that gathered the firelight and threw it out across the water. Some say the mirror was bronze. Some say it was a different alloy, carefully shaped to catch and bend the glow. We do not know what it was made of, or how large it was, or whether it could really be seen, as some accounts claim, from many miles out at sea. What we do know is that the tower was not a single, frozen object. It was repaired again and again. Earthquakes shook the coast of Egypt many times in the centuries after it was built. Each tremor cracked the stones a little more. Each repair changed the shape of the building, sometimes by a small amount, sometimes by a great deal. The lighthouse that travelers saw in the year 500 was not quite the same lighthouse that travelers had seen in the year 100. The bones were the same. The skin had changed. The sea itself was changing too. The coast of Alexandria has shifted over the long centuries. The land has sunk in places. The water has crept inland. Parts of the old city now lie beneath the harbor, quiet and green with weeds and small fish. The island of Pharos, where the lighthouse stood, was once linked to the mainland by a long causeway. Over time, sand built up against that causeway. The narrow bridge of stone became a wide neck of land. The geography the lighthouse had been built to mark was slowly, patiently rearranging itself underneath it. By the medieval period, the tower had lost its top. One account says an earthquake brought the upper section down. Another suggests the damage came in stages, with one level falling, and then, much later, another. The flame, whatever it had been, was gone. For a long time, the lower stories still stood, a stubby ruin where a giant had once been. Travelers from far away still came to see it. They climbed what was left. They wrote down what they saw. Their notes do not always agree. In the 14th century, more earthquakes finished the work. The last great stones came down. A few hundred years later, a fortress rose on the same spot, built partly from the rubble of the old tower. Stones that had once held the flame above the sea were now part of thick defensive walls at sea level. The lighthouse had not vanished. It had been folded into something else. The change did not stop there. In recent decades, divers exploring the harbor floor have found enormous blocks of carved stone lying in the shallow water. Some weigh many tons. Some show the marks of fine cutting. Researchers believe that at least some of these blocks are pieces of the old lighthouse, shaken loose and tipped into the sea by the long centuries of quakes. The tower that once shone above the water now rests, in part, beneath it. The light is gone. The stones are still here. What we are seeing when we look at this story across thousands of years is a single building slowly turning into many things. A flame, a ruin, a quarry, a fortress, a field of broken stones on the seabed. None of these forms is the real lighthouse, and all of them are. The wonder did not end in one moment. It dissolved across time, the way a sandcastle dissolves under a rising tide, only much, much more slowly. The mystery of the mirror itself, the question of how that ancient light actually reached the ships, may never be fully solved. The pieces are scattered. The witnesses are long gone. The mirror, if there ever was a single mirror, lies somewhere we have not yet found, or has long since been melted down and remade into something else. Like so much about the seven wonders, what we have left is a memory of a memory, repaired and re-repaired, until we can no longer tell where the original tower ends and the long retelling begins. Of the seven wonders the ancients listed, 6 are gone. And of those 6, the ground itself helped take most of them down. Not war, not greed, not slow forgetting. The earth simply moved beneath them, and the light they once threw into the sky went out. Picture the eastern Mediterranean from above on a quiet evening long ago. The sun is low. The sea glows in soft copper. Along its edges stand harbors and temples, their marble warming in the last light. A lighthouse blinks on the coast of Egypt. A great statue once stood by a harbor in Rhodes. A temple shines on a hill in Ephesus. From the air, the coast looks calm. But under it, 2 great slabs of the planet's crust press against each other, slowly and without rest. The African plate pushes north. The Eurasian plate pushes back. The line where they meet runs right through the world that built the wonders. That quiet pressure is what shapes the light of this region. The same forces that lift the mountains and warm the springs also shake the ground every few generations. Soft amber sunsets fall on cliffs that were raised by the very faults that bring them down. The light is gentle. The land beneath it is not. The Lighthouse of Alexandria is the clearest case. For hundreds of years, it stood at the edge of its island, throwing fire and reflected sunlight far out to sea. Sailors used it as a daylight marker and a nighttime beacon. Then, beginning in the 8th century and continuing into the 14th, a series of earthquakes shook the Egyptian coast. The tower cracked. Stones fell. The flame at the top went dark. By the time the last great quake struck in 1303, the lighthouse was little more than a stump. Its blocks were later used to build a fort on the same spot. The light that guided ships for over 1,000 years went out one tremor at a time. The Colossus of Rhodes fell faster. It had stood for only about 54 years when, in 226 BCE, a strong earthquake rocked the island. The bronze giant snapped at the knees and crashed across the harbor. Ancient writers say the broken pieces lay where they fell for centuries, gleaming dully in the sun, while travelers came simply to stand beside them and marvel. The wonder was gone, but its body remained, lit by the same sea light it had once watched over. The temple of Artemis at Ephesus had a longer and stranger story. It was rebuilt several times, damaged by flood, by fire, by raiders, and likely also by tremors in the soft, marshy ground beneath it. The Mausoleum at Halikarnassos stood for around 16 centuries before earthquakes between the 12th and 15th centuries finally brought its roof and upper tiers crashing down. The statue of Zeus at Olympia is harder to place. Some sources say it was carried off to a distant city and lost in a fire. Others wonder if a quake helped damage the temple that housed it. The records thin out, and the certainty thins with them. Only one wonder still stands in full sunlight. The Great Pyramid of Giza sits on a stable plateau of limestone, far from the active fault lines of the Aegean and the Levant. It has felt tremors, yes, but nothing strong enough to topple it. Its light is the oldest light on the list, falling on the same stones at dawn for over 4,000 years. What we are left with then is a pattern. The wonders that survived sit on quiet ground. The wonders that fell sat on shaking ground. The question that remains open is how much of their loss was sudden and how much was slow. A single quake can crack a tower, but it takes neglect and reuse and the patient hands of later builders to truly erase a thing. Stones that fell from the lighthouse became walls of a fortress. Marble from the mausoleum became part of a castle by the sea. The earthquakes broke them. The centuries carried them away. And so the light moves on. It still falls on the Egyptian coast, on the harbors of Rhodes and Halikarnassos, on the long grass of Olympia and the hills of Ephesus. It touches stones that were once shaped by master sculptors and now lie half buried in soil or beneath we wonder how much more of those broken wonders still lies just beneath the surface, waiting for a quieter moment when someone bends down and brushes the dust away. When a wonder fell, it rarely fell silent all at once. The first sound was the great one, the roar of stone parting from stone, the deep crack of marble splitting along old seams, the long sigh of dust rolling out across the streets. After that came a quieter sound, one that lasted for centuries. It was the soft scrape of chisels, the creak of wooden carts, the slow tap of hammers as people came to take the broken wonders away. Stone is heavy. Cut stone, shaped by master hands, is even more valuable than the rock it came from. So when a temple or a tomb or a lighthouse fell, the blocks did not stay where they landed. They were lifted, dragged, floated on barges, and built into new walls in other towns. The wonders did not always vanish. Sometimes they simply moved. Listen in your mind to the harbor of Alexandria many hundreds of years after the lighthouse fell. The great tower lay in pieces, some in the water, some on the rocky shore. Workers came with ropes and sledges. They hauled the fallen blocks up the slope. Years later, a fortress rose on the same point of land, built partly from the stones of the lighthouse itself. That fortress still stands today. Inside its quiet walls, some of the stones may once have held the mirror that threw light across the sea. We are not always sure which block came from where. The records are thin. The stones do not speak their old names. The same thing happened at Halikarnassos. After the great tomb of the king cracked and tumbled, knights arrived on the coast many centuries later and built a castle of their own. They wanted strong, smooth blocks, and the ruined mausoleum offered them in great supply. They took the green stone, the white marble, the carved panels, and they fitted them into the walls of their fortress by the sea. Some of the carvings, the ones showing horses and warriors, were later pulled back out and carried away to museums far from home. Other pieces stayed inside the castle walls, where they remain to this day, half hidden, mortared in place. This is the sound of the wonders in their second life, the soft knocking of new mortar, the slow rasp of a saw shortening an old block, the murmur of workmen who may not have known what they were holding. At Ephesus, the great temple of Artemis followed the same quiet path. After the marshes swallowed its lower levels and earthquakes shook down its columns, local people came and took what they could lift. Some pieces went into churches. Some went into Roman bathhouses. Some, much later, traveled by ship to distant cities where they were set into the floors and walls of grand new buildings. Researchers still find columns and bases that may have belonged to the temple, scattered across the old Mediterranean world. There is a strange kind of music in this. A wonder is built, stands for centuries, then falls. Its stones become a fortress, a church, a harbor wall, a humble house. The shape of the wonder is gone, but the matter of it lives on, holding up roofs, lining wells, paving streets. People walk past these stones every day without knowing what they once were. This is part of why the open question is so hard to answer. When we ask how much of each wonder was real and how much has been lost, the honest reply is that some of it was never lost at all. It was only scattered. The challenge for researchers is to recognize it. A single block in a modern wall might match the size and cut of a famous temple, or it might not. Without a clear chain of records, the match remains a guess. One careful study suggests a stone came from the Lighthouse. Another careful study suggests it came from a much later building that simply copied the old style. Both views can be argued. Neither can be proved without doubt. So the wonders may still be all around us, woven into newer walls, quiet and unmarked. The Great Pyramid kept its smooth white casing for thousands of years, but most of those polished blocks were eventually pried off and used to build mosques and palaces in nearby cities. Walk through certain old streets today, and the stones beside you may have once gleamed at the top of the pyramid, catching the desert sun. This is the long, slow sound of the wonders after their falling. Not silence, not gone, only resettled into the rhythm of other lives, other towns, other centuries, waiting, perhaps, for someone to listen closely enough to hear where they came from. Long before the wonders fell, before the stones tumbled, and the bronze melted, and the gardens, wherever they truly stood, faded into legend, there were travelers travelers who walked among them. They counted steps. They measured shadows. They wrote down numbers. And those numbers, simple as they seem, are part of the reason we still wonder today. The most famous of these counters was a man named Antipater of Sidon. He lived in the 2nd century before the Common Era. He wrote a short poem that listed the 7 wonders together, almost like a quiet song. His numbers were not always exact. Some were borrowed, some were stretched, but the act of counting them, of grouping them, gave the world a list that has lasted more than 2,000 years. Another traveler, Philo of Byzantium, may have written an even earlier guide. Or someone using his name did, centuries later. Scholars still argue about which Philo wrote which book. The math of the wonders begins then with a small mystery about the writers themselves. What the travelers measured, though, has a strange beauty. The base of the Great Pyramid is almost a perfect square. Each side runs about 230 meters long. The 4 sides differ from one another by only a few centimeters. Across a structure that large, that level of accuracy is almost hard to picture. Imagine drawing a square the length of 2 football fields and being off by less than the width of your hand on any side. The pyramid also points very close to true north, not magnetic north, which drifts, but true north, the spin axis of the earth. The error is tiny, smaller than 1/10 of 1 degree. How the builders measured this without modern tools is still an open question. One idea is that they used the stars, watching a bright pair circle the pole and marking the midpoint. Another idea is that they used the sun, tracking the tip of a shadow at sunrise and sunset. The math works either way. Which method they actually used, we do not know. The Lighthouse at Alexandria offered different numbers. Ancient writers said it stood somewhere between 100 and 140 meters tall. That range is wide, and it tells us something honest. Even people who saw the tower with their own eyes guessed at its height. They had no laser, no drone, no clean way to measure a structure that tall. So they paced its shadow. They counted its tiers. They estimated. The lighthouse in our records lives inside that gentle uncertainty. The Colossus of Rhodes was said to be about 33 meters tall. comes mainly from Philo and from later writers who copied him. It is close to the height of the Statue of Liberty, not counting her pedestal. Whether the real bronze giant matched that figure exactly, no one can say. The math of the Colossus is a remembered math, not a measured one. What is striking is how often the ancient builders worked with simple ratios. The Mausoleum at Halikarnassos rose in 3 clean parts: a square base, a ring of columns, a stepped pyramid above. Each part was roughly equal in height to the others, 3/3 stacked, with a chariot at the top. The temple of Artemis used columns that were said to be about 18 meters tall, set in long, even rows. The statue of Zeus filled its temple so completely that, by one estimate, if the god had stood up, his head would have broken through the roof. That last figure is not a measurement. It is a feeling written down as a number, so we could share the feeling. This is the quiet beauty of ancient math. It mixes careful counting with awe. It mixes exact corners with rough heights. It mixes what the eye saw with what the heart wanted to say. Modern researchers can sometimes check these numbers. They can survey the pyramid plateau with lasers. They can scan the seabed at Alexandria. They can sift the foundations at Ephesus and measure the column drums that remain. Sometimes the old numbers hold up surprisingly well. Sometimes they drift. Sometimes the wonder, when we find it, is smaller or larger than the travelers said. And so a soft question floats up out of the arithmetic. How much of what the ancients wrote was measured, and how much was remembered through feeling? The numbers are not lies. They are not perfect either. They sit somewhere in between, the way memory itself does. They are the math of human eyes, scribbled down by hand, carried across centuries on fragile pages, waiting for someone much later to read them by lamplight and try gently to imagine what was once truly there. Long after the wonders themselves had crumbled, something curious happened. People who had never seen them began to draw them. They painted them on parchment, etched them into copper plates, and pressed them into the pages of books. These later images were not records made from life. They were guesses, drawn by artists working from old stories, broken descriptions, and their own dreaming imaginations. The maps and drawings that came later form a strange kind of evidence. They tell us less about the wonders themselves and more about how each century remembered them. A medieval monk might sketch the Lighthouse of Alexandria as a square tower with a small dome on top, looking very much like a church bell tower he knew from his own town. A Renaissance engraver might draw the hanging gardens as a tall stepped palace with neat European trees, more like something from a Florentine villa than from old Mesopotamia. Each drawing carried the fingerprints of its own age. This is part of why the central question stays open. We do not have a single trustworthy picture made by someone who actually stood before all 7 wonders. The closest we get are coins, a few carved reliefs, and short written passages. Everything else is layered memory. And memory, as you know, softens and shifts with every retelling. The balance here is fragile in a quiet way. For us to know what these wonders truly looked like, several delicate conditions would have to line up. The original artists would have needed to leave detailed plans. Those plans would have needed to survive fire, flood, war, and the slow nibbling of insects and damp. They would then have needed to be copied again and again by hands that did not change them too much. And finally, those copies would have needed to reach us. Almost none of that happened. The chain broke in many places. Think of how thin the surviving evidence really is. A description by a traveler, a short paragraph in a geography book, a poem praising a city, a coin worn smooth by centuries of hands. From these slender threads, later artists tried to weave full pictures. And so, we got engravings of the Colossus of Rhodes standing with its legs straddling the harbor mouth. A pose most scholars now think was almost certainly impossible. The drawing felt grand, so it spread. It became, in many minds, the wonder itself. One theory about these later images is that they were never meant as accurate reconstructions at all. They were meant as devotional pictures, almost like icons of lost greatness. A viewer in the year 1500 did not need the Mausoleum to look correct. They needed it to look wondrous. The drawing was a feeling more than a blueprint. Another view is gentler. Some of these later artists genuinely tried their best with what fragments they had, and they should be read as honest attempts rather than fantasies. Both views may be partly right. The fragility shows up in another way too. Even when a stone fragment survives, even when a foundation is uncovered, scholars must decide how to fit it into the picture. A column drum from Ephesus might match one ancient description and contradict another. A carved relief from Halikarnassos might show a horse and rider that could belong to several different friezes. Tiny shifts in interpretation lead to very different reconstructions. Change one variable, and the whole imagined wonder leans a different way. It is a little like trying to redraw a face from a handful of old, faded photographs taken from awkward angles. You can get the general shape. You can guess the color of the eyes, but the exact expression, the small, unique details that made the face truly itself, those stay just out of reach. The wonders are like that. We can sketch their outlines. We cannot quite see their faces. And yet the drawings keep coming. Every generation seems to need its own version. Modern reconstructions made with computers look sharper and more confident than the old engravings, but they too rest on the same thin evidence. They too will look quaint in a few hundred years, when a future age makes its own pictures from the same fragments. The wonders have become a kind of mirror. Each century looks into them and partly sees itself. So as you rest tonight, you might picture a long shelf of old books, their pages full of careful, hopeful drawings. Each artist trying to catch something that slipped away long before they were born. Each picture beautiful, each picture partly wrong, each picture a small offering to a memory no one alive has ever truly seen. The maps and drawings that came later did not solve the mystery. They only kept it warm, passing it gently from hand to hand, century after century. Of all the wonders, only one still stands in plain view. The Great Pyramid of Giza rises from the desert, as it has for more than 4,000 years, weathered but whole. The other 6 are gone or scattered, or possibly hiding beneath the soil and the sea. And that is where the story becomes strange and quiet and full of open doors. Think for a moment about what what searching really means here. Archaeologists are not looking for the wonders the way a child looks for a lost toy. They are looking for traces. A single carved stone in the wall of a later building. A shape on the seafloor that does not match the natural rock around it. A line of foundation hidden under a modern city where no one is allowed to dig because homes and shops stand on top of it. The wonders are not simply missing. They are tangled into the layers of the world that came after them. The hanging gardens are perhaps the deepest puzzle of all. No one has ever found them. Not a tile, not a pipe, not a single agreed upon brick. Some researchers have spent their whole lives walking the dusty mounds of old Babylon, looking for the right pattern of canals or terraces. Others have begun to wonder if they were searching the wrong city all along. The gardens may lie beneath a place we have not yet thought to dig, or they may have been built of wood and mud that simply melted back into the earth after centuries of rain. The question stays open. In the harbor of Alexandria, divers slip into water that is cloudy and warm. Beneath them, on the seafloor, lie great blocks of stone. Some are columns. Some are pieces of statues. Some, almost certainly, are fragments of the famous lighthouse that once stood on the island of Pharos. But which blocks belonged to the lighthouse and which belonged to other buildings nearby is still being worked out. Each stone must be measured, mapped, and matched to old descriptions. The seafloor there is like a vast, scattered library whose pages have been shuffled by earthquakes and tides. At Halikarnassos, the tomb of the king is gone, but its footprint remains. Archaeologists have found the platform, the staircase, the broken sculptures carried off to distant museums. Yet the exact height, the exact shape of the roof, the way the chariot at the top was mounted, these things are still argued about. Different scholars draw different reconstructions, and each drawing carries a quiet asterisk. We think it looked like this. We are not sure. The Colossus of Rhodes leaves an even thinner trail. No one knows for certain where it stood. The famous image of the bronze giant straddling the harbor mouth is almost surely a later invention. The statue probably stood on land near the water, but the exact spot is debated. Modern roads, is a busy island town, and the ground beneath it holds secrets that may never be reachable. Some researchers hope a future construction project will uncover the base. Others think the foundations were quarried away long ago for other buildings. The statue of Zeus and the temple of Artemis leave us with similar gaps. The temple's foundations have been mapped, and a single lonely column has been raised again at Ephesus to mark the spot. But the full glory of the building, its colors, its decorations, the smell of incense inside it, must be imagined from a few worn fragments and the words of old travelers. The workshop where Zeus was carved has been found at Olympia, with bits of ivory and tools, and even a small cup with the sculptor's name on it. Yet the statue itself, the great seated figure of the god, exists now only in copies and descriptions. What all of this means is that the search is not finished. Far from it. New tools arrive every decade. Ground-penetrating radar lets archaeologists see beneath soil without breaking it. Sonar maps the seafloor in fine detail. Computer models compare ancient descriptions to surviving ruins and suggest where to dig next. Satellites notice faint shapes in the landscape that the human eye would miss. Each new method opens a new door, and behind each door there are quieter questions waiting. Somewhere, perhaps, a farmer's field hides a wall. Somewhere, a bay holds a foundation. Somewhere, a stone in a much later building was once part of a wonder, and no one yet knows it. The list the ancients made is not closed. It is still being read slowly by patient hands in places where the dust is thick and the light is soft and the centuries have settled gently over everything. Of all the 7 wonders, the Hanging Gardens may be the strangest case of all. We have no stones from them, no foundations we can point to with certainty, no carving that shows them in full bloom. And yet the ancient writers spoke of them as if they were real, with terraces of trees rising like a green mountain in the middle of a dry land. The mystery is not just how they were built. The mystery is where they ever stood at all. For many centuries, people simply trusted the name. The gardens were called Babylonian, so they must have been in Babylon, the famous city on the Euphrates River in what is now Iraq. Travelers searched the old ruins. Archaeologists dug into mounds of mud brick. They found palaces, walls, gates, and the foundations of great temples. But they did not find clear proof of a stepped garden with its watered terraces and its hanging vines. The soil held silence where the legend asked for green. This silence opened a door for a new theory. One modern researcher spent years comparing the ancient texts with the archaeology of two different cities. She noticed something curious. The vivid descriptions of the gardens fit much more closely with another place, far to the north. That place was Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian kings. Stone carvings from Nineveh show tall trees on terraces, watered by clever channels and lifted by screws of bronze. A king named Sennacherib even boasted of building a wonder near his palace, a garden of all the plants of the world. If this theory is right, then the hanging gardens were never in Babylon at all. They grew at Nineveh, beside the Tigris River, on a different set of hills. The name in the old Greek texts may have been a slip of memory, or a confusion between two rival cities of the same broad region. Both Babylon and Nineveh sat in the land the Greeks called Assyria in some of their writings. Over the centuries, the gardens may have drifted in the telling, from one capital to another, until even the careful historians wrote down the wrong address. Other scholars are not yet convinced. They point out that the Babylon theory has its own quiet support. The city had great walls, advanced waterworks, and kings who loved to build. A clever ruler could have raised terraces above the dry plain and watered them from the Euphrates. The absence of ruins does not prove absence of gardens. Mud brick melts in the rain. Wooden beams rot. A green wonder made mostly of plants and packed earth would leave little trace after 2,000 years. Silence in the soil is not the same as a final answer. A third possibility sits quietly between the two. Perhaps there were several famous gardens across the ancient Near East, and the legend we received is a blending of them all. The mind of memory is a generous mixer. Travelers came home with stories of terraces in one city and fountains in another. And over time, the tales softened into a single shining image. tried to pin the wonder to one map, the gardens had already become a kind of dream that grew in more than one place at once. What will the future make of this question? In 100 years, new tools may help. Ground-penetrating radar can already see foundations buried beneath modern streets. Satellite imagery shows the faint shadows of old canals from high above. Patient digging at both Babylon and Nineveh may yet uncover a stepped platform, a watering channel, or a clay tablet that names the place. A single inscription, read carefully, could settle centuries of guessing. And in 1,000,000 years, all of this will look different again. The rivers that fed both cities will have shifted in their beds. The mounds will have worn flatter. New layers of earth will lie above the old palaces, sealing them like pages in a slow book. Perhaps by then, some future student of deep time will look back and see Babylon and Nineveh as two faint glows in the same long candle of human longing. The longing to grow a garden where no garden should grow. For now, the question stays gently open. The hanging gardens may have stood on the Euphrates, lifted by screws and channels we have not yet found. They may have stood on the Tigris, in the shadow of a different king. They may have lived in more than one city, or in none at all. We can wonder which version is true while the rest of the world sleeps. The terraces, wherever they were, are quiet now, and the soft green of their leaves grows only in the imagination, which is, perhaps, the only soil that never runs dry. Step back now, as far back as you can, and look at the whole shape of what we have been wondering about tonight. 7 buildings, 7 works of human hands, seen by a few travelers, written down on a few scraps of paper, remembered for more than 2,000 years. That is all it took to make a list that still glows in the human mind. And when you hold that thought gently, something larger begins to open behind it. The people who built these wonders were made of the same stuff you are made of. The calcium in their bones, the iron in their blood, the oxygen they breathed in the warm air of the Aegean. All of it came from older stars that lived and died long before Earth was born. Every stone they lifted onto the mausoleum was made of atoms older than the planet itself. The marble of the temple of Artemis began as tiny sea creatures, pressed into rock over millions of years on an ancient seabed. The limestone of the Great Pyramid is full of small shells, each one a quiet life that ended long before any pharaoh was named. So in a way, the wonders were never only human. They were the planet lending its old bones to a young species, and the young species shaping those bones into something that could outlast them. The bronze of the Colossus came from copper, and tin pulled out of deep veins in the earth. The fire on top of the pharaohs burned wood from forests that pulled their carbon from the air. Every wonder was a quiet collaboration between a brief human life and a planet that had been busy for billions of years. And the wonder itself, the feeling, the soft catch in the chest when a traveler first saw the harbor of Rhodes or the gardens of Babylon, that may be the strangest thing of all. We still do not fully understand why human beings feel awe. One idea is that awe helped our ancestors slow down and pay attention to things larger than themselves. Another is that it is simply a side effect of having a mind big enough to imagine more than it can hold. The question stays open, but whatever awe is, it seems to be how we measure the world against our own small size and find ourselves gently moved. The ancient list was a way of catching that feeling in writing, a way of saying, here are the places where a person stood still and felt the world become very large. Most of the 7 are gone now. The stones have been carried away. The bronze melted. The gardens, if they ever grew where we think they grew, long since dry. And yet the list survives. The memory of the wonders has outlasted the wonders themselves. That may be the deepest mystery of the whole story. The buildings were made of rock and metal. The list is made only of words, and the words have proven, in their own quiet way, to be the more durable material. Think of all the things that had to happen for that list to reach you tonight. A Greek writer had to scratch it onto a scroll. The scroll had to be copied and copied again by hands in lamplit rooms across many centuries. Empires had to rise and fall around those scrolls without destroying them. Languages had to change, and translators had to carry the meaning across. And finally, more than 2,000 years later, the quiet room where someone is trying to fall asleep. That chain is its own wonder, possibly the eighth. The earth, meanwhile, keeps doing what it has always done. The plates beneath the old harbors keep shifting. The sea keeps climbing and falling. The desert sand keeps drifting over forgotten foundations. Somewhere, perhaps, a fragment of the Mausoleum is still buried in a wall in Turkey, waiting. Somewhere, a piece of the Colossus may rest in the silt of the Rhodian seabed. Somewhere, the true site of the Hanging Gardens may still hold its breath under a layer of soil. The planet keeps the secrets patiently. It is in no hurry to give them back. And you, listening now, are part of the same long story. The same atoms, the same quiet capacity for wonder, the same brief life held inside a much older world. The ancient list does not really tell us about 7 buildings. It tells us that human beings, given a little time and a few good stones, will try to build something worth remembering. And that the wanting to remember may be the most human thing of all. And so we come to the end of our long, slow walk through the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The lamps have grown dim. The travelers have closed their books. The dust has settled on the stones. What remains is a quiet feeling, soft as a wool blanket, that we have been in the company of something very old and very gentle. 7 wonders, 7 stories, some still standing in the desert, some scattered in pieces on the sea floor, some known only through the words of people who saw them long ago and tried in careful ink to describe what they had seen. The Great Pyramid still rises above the sand at Giza, patient as the sun. The other 6 live now in memory, in shards of marble, in the warm glow of imagination. And through it all, the questions remain. We do not know with full certainty how the pyramid was built. We do not know where the Hanging Gardens truly grew, or even whether they grew in Babylon at all. We do not know exactly how the bronze Colossus stood above the harbor at Rhodes. We do not know the precise shape of the lighthouse at Alexandria, though pieces of it still rest beneath the water near the old shore. We do not know the full face of Zeus as he sat in his cedar throne, or the exact pattern of carvings that wrapped the tomb at Halikarnassos. We do not know how many times the temple at Ephesus was rebuilt, or what its priests truly believed in the deepest hours of the night. These gaps are not failures. They are open doors. Each missing piece is a small invitation left for us by the people who came before. A whisper that says, perhaps one day, someone will find a fragment, a tablet, a coin, a carving. Perhaps a diver will brush sand from a stone and find a piece of the lighthouse the size of a chariot. Perhaps a scholar will read an old line of cuneiform and finally settle the question of the gardens. Perhaps not. Perhaps the wonders will keep their secrets, and that too is a kind of gift. For now, picture the earth as it is tonight. A quiet blue sphere turning slowly in the soft dark. Oceans rising and falling with the pull of the moon. Continents drifting at the pace of fingernails growing. Deserts cooling under the stars. Forests breathing in long, slow tides of air. Above the sands of Giza, the pyramid still stands, its stones warm from the day, its base anchored to bedrock that has not moved in millions of years. The ruins of Halikarnassos sleep beneath a modern town. The temple foundations at Ephesus rest in their quiet marsh. The harbor at Rhodes carries small boats above the place where a bronze giant once stood. The waters off Alexandria hold their broken stones in patient stillness. The planet holds all of it. The wonders that survived. The wonders that fell. The wonders we are still looking for. The wonders we may never find. It holds the builders and the travelers and the writers and the readers, the children who heard the stories and the elders who told them. It holds you too, lying in the soft dark, listening to a voice describe a list that was first written down more than 2,000 years ago. There is a kind of comfort in that. To know that wonder is not a new thing. To know that people have always looked up at tall stones and down at deep harbors and felt something quiet stir inside them. To know that we are part of a long, slow line of curious minds, each one passing the list along to the next. The mystery of the ancient wonders does not need to be solved tonight. It does not need to be solved at all. It is enough for now to know that the questions are there, glowing softly in the distance like lanterns at the edge of a field. We can walk toward them slowly. We can rest along the way. We can let the wondering itself be the gift. So let the world keep turning. Let the deserts cool. Let the harbors sleep. Let the old stones hold their secrets a little longer. There will be time tomorrow and the day after to wonder again. For tonight, let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders soften. Let the long list of wonders settle into the warm dark behind your eyes. The earth is vast and gentle and patient, and you are held inside it, safe and small and quiet. Subscribe for a brand new Earth topic every night. One tap, and something wonderful is waiting for you tomorrow. Sweet dreams.